It gives me great honor to be able to introduce our keynote speakers, Tasha Manoranjan and Nimmi Gaurinathan. Tasha Manoranjan is the founder and director of People for Equality and Relief in Sri Lanka, PEARL, a nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated to promoting human rights in Sri Lanka. She spent over a year documenting human rights violations committed against Tamil civilians in northern Sri Lanka and remains committed to pursuing accountability for violations of international law. Tasha is currently an associate in Sidley Austin LLP's litigation practice in the Washington, D.C. office. Tasha earned her law degree at Yale Law School, where she served as the features editor and book reviewer for the Yale Journal of International Law, chair of the South Asian Law Students Association, and community enrichment chair of the Women of Color Collective. While at Yale, Tasha wrote a paper entitled, quote, "Beaten but Not Broken, Tamil Women in Sri Lanka," end quote, which was subsequently published at 11 Georgetown Journal of International Affairs 139 in 2010. Tasha received her BA magna cum laude in Justice and Peace Studies from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Please welcome Tasha Manoranjan.
Thank you, Darshika. First, let me say how honored I am to be here today and to take part in today's conference to celebrate International Women's Day. It is a remarkable achievement for our community and for women worldwide to celebrate International Women's Day with such a progressive, inclusive conference. I want to congratulate the organizers for putting together a conference addressing topics that have been taboo for too long in our society. As a Tamil and as a woman, it is a pleasure to participate here today. I have been trained as an attorney, but feel much more comfortable identifying myself as an activist. I have been advocating for Tamil rights for nearly 10 years now. I founded PEARL to work with policymakers, media, and the public when I was in college after I volunteered in Venni. I taught English at Senjole and other children's homes and realized that the girls I knew whose parents had been killed in artillery shelling or aerial bombardment or simply disappeared could have easily have been me. But for the circumstance of my parents fleeing earlier in the war, I could have grown up spending my childhood in underground bunkers too. When I returned to the States, I knew I had the responsibility and privilege of working to better the lives of my Tamil brothers and sisters back home, and have been working for the struggle ever since. Today, I want to focus first on the issue of genocide and draw from international law to demonstrate what happened to Tamils in 2009 was clearly genocide. Next, I will focus on the current crisis facing Tamils, and particularly Tamil women, by focusing on singleization, militarization, sexual violence, and reproductive violence. Lastly, I will briefly touch on the current situation in the international community with the UN Human Rights Council starting on Monday. In 2009, it has been well documented by doctors and international groups like Human Rights Watch and the ICRC that hospitals were intentionally targeted. Indeed, makeshift and permanent hospitals were shelled by the Sri Lankan army over 30 times in the early months of 2009. The question is why? Were these hospitals targeted because the government thought they were LTTE military installations? Or were they targeted to inflict conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Venni population? If the latter, this clearly demonstrates genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Similarly, Tamil civilians were told to congregate in 3 successive no-fire zones. These no-fire zones were then targeted by continuous army shelling. Were these no-fire zones targeted to eradicate the LTTE, or was this part of a government strategy to inflict as much destruction as possible on the Tamil community? A UN panel of experts report found evidence of the crime against humanity of persecution having been committed against the Venni population. This means that these Tamils were attacked specifically because of their identity as Venni Tamils. The difference between the crime against humanity of persecution and the crime of genocide is the issue of intent. That is, whether the Sri Lankan government intended to destroy part of the Tamil ethnicity, specifically the Venni Tamil population. International law has held that genocidal intent can be inferred based on the factual circumstances of the crime. In analyzing genocidal intent, it is helpful to look at international precedent, specifically in Srebrenica in Eastern Europe. In Srebrenica, 7,000 to 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men were executed, and the women and children were forced to leave. The strategic and symbolic significance of Srebrenica made it such that it was a highly valued territory for both the Bosnian Muslims and the Serbs. Similarly, the Venni region is of great strategic and symbolic significance. It is at the crux of the northern and eastern provinces, and thereby upholds or obliterates claims for Tamilulam in these areas. Venni was the headquarters for the LTTE administration. The police, the Department of Agriculture, the courts, and the Bank of Tamilulam were all based in Venni. Venni Tamils were a significant subset of the Tamil population on the island, based on the perception that these were the most supportive of the LTTE campaign for Tamil statehood. There's a prima facie case of genocidal intent by the Sri Lankan government to destroy Venni Tamils, as evidenced by the military strategy they deliberately employed to inflict as much destruction as possible against Venni Tamils. Specifically, the government dropped pamphlets ordering civilians into the no-fire zones and then intentionally shelled these dense civilian areas. The government deliberately understated how many civilians were in the conflict zone, saying there were only 70,000 civilians there in January of 2009, while the Red Cross estimated over 250,000 Tamils. The government understated the population size to allow minimal humanitarian aid into the region and to starve the population into submission. Furthermore, after the war ended, the government herded the almost 300,000 Tamils into internment camps, and the government initially stated they wanted to keep the Tamils in these internment camps for up to 3 years. Only after outrage by the international community at such an egregious violation of international law did the government start releasing Tamils from these dangerously militarized camps. As the situation in Sri Lanka worsens today, international outrage is again necessary. The Sentinel Project, a Toronto-based human rights group, said that the risk of mass atrocities in Sri Lanka remains high. This is based on the heavy militarization in the north and east and reassertions of Sinhalese power, seen particularly in the Sinhalization of the north. Sri Lanka has a painful history of silencing dissent through violence, and this is seen today with widespread disappearances, arbitrary arrest, and torture. This brings us to the current crisis facing Tamils, and particularly Tamil women. The Sri Lankan government has intensified its aggressive campaign to Sinhalize the ethnically Tamil areas in the north and east. Operating under the guise of preventing a highly unlikely resurrection of Tamil militancy and with the intent of creating a homogeneous Sinhala Buddhist Sri Lankan identity, Sinhalization is a state-sponsored program aimed at eliminating the Tamil culture, language, and identity from Sri Lanka. This is genocide. Sri Lanka's President Mahinda Rajapaksa is implementing development in ways that are methodologically disempowering, disenfranchising, and extinguishing the Tamil people as a collective. Currently, there is 1 soldier for every 5 Tamils in the north, an absurdly high statistic given that the war ostensibly ended 5 years ago. In Tamil-speaking areas, the Sri Lankan military has increased its economic role, expanded the amount of land it controls, and essentially establishing itself as a permanent, occupying presence. This occupation, allegedly designed to prevent the renewal of militancy, is rapidly alienating Tamils and subverting the quote-unquote reconciliation process. Heavy militarization of the North and East has led to drastic increases in Sinhalese settlers, land grabs, construction of Buddhist temples, conversion of village names and street signs from Tamil to Sinhalese, and unrestricted Sinhalese enterprise, all of which threaten to permanently alter the local demography and exacerbate ethnic tensions. The Sunday Leader released an expose of the systemic Sinhalization of the North and East, stating that the entire Munnikulam village in Mannar had been taken over by the Navy and their families, while the people who originally called this village home had no place to stay. The result was over 2,000 families living in temporary settlements in the jungle. Last May, over 1,000 Tamils filed a petition against the government's confiscation of their land. Their petition stated that 6,300 acres were appropriated to build another army base in Jaffna. A large number of them were refused permission to return to their lands and were forced to remain in the, quote, welfare camps. The extreme level of militarization uniquely affects Tamil women. There are thousands of female-headed households after the end of armed conflict. These women are especially vulnerable to sexual violence due to the military's predatory practices. The soldiers who brutalized Tamils in Mulivaikal are the same soldiers living next door to Tamil women today. Imagine living next door to your husband's killer and not knowing whether he was coming to rape you tomorrow. This is how many women are currently subsisting. NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Freedom from Torture have reported on widespread and systematic sexual violence inflicted on Tamil women and men, including in detention and, quote, rehabilitation centers. Local NGOs focusing on women's rights have reported on forced conscription over 100 young Tamil women and girls from Venni into an overwhelmingly Sinhalese military under the pretext of performing clerical work. These women were not allowed to leave or contact their families when informed that they would be instead performing military duties. In December of 2012, 13 of these women were admitted to Kilinochchi Hospital, and many were found to be unconscious. They were denied access to hospital staff, their families, and a local Tamil parliamentarian who inquired after their condition. Recent reports from local human rights groups have also documented hundreds of Tamil women in northern Sri Lanka being forced to accept surgical implantation of long-term birth control. These reports add to previous reports of forced sterilization of Tamil women both during and after the war. In May 2007, a confidential cable from the U.S. Embassy in Colombo discussed an EPDP medical doctor who performed forced abortions, often under the guise of a regular checkup, on Tamil women suspected of being aligned with the LTTE. A health department report from the northern province in 2012 found a 30 times higher rate of birth control implants of Tamil women in Mullaitivu compared to the much more densely populated Jaffna. In August 2013, government health workers forced mothers to accept surgically implanted birth control in 3 villages in Kilinochchi. When the women objected, the nurses said that if they did not agree to the contraceptive, they could be denied treatment at the hospital in the future. According to the Home for Human Rights, an organization devoted to protecting fundamental rights of those in Sri Lanka, more than 80% of Tamil women in central Sri Lanka were offered a lump sum payment of usually 500 rupees in return for their ability to reproduce. After receiving this payment, women underwent surgical sterilization. Though seemingly small, this sum is large for these predominantly plantation workers. The population of this Tamil group has dropped annually since 1996 by 5%, whereas the population of the country overall has grown by 14%. In contrast, police and army officers have been encouraged by the Sri Lankan government to have a third child through payment of 100,000 rupees from the government. The officers taking advantage of this offer are unsurprisingly Sinhalese. Home for Human Rights said, this systemic pattern of authority-sanctioned coerced sterilizations may amount to an intentional destruction of the Tamil estate population. These cases of coerced birth control and forced sterilization are clear evidence of genocide. The Genocide Convention obligation to prevent and punish genocide is not a matter of political choice or calculation, but one of binding international law. The UN Security Council should refer Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court for investigation and prosecutions into war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Concurrently, courts in countries that may exercise jurisdiction over the events and alleged perpetrators should prosecute these crimes. I worked with American University's Human Rights Impact Litigation Clinic to file a lawsuit against Sri Lankan General Shavendra Silva, head of the 58th Division of the Sri Lanka Army. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka appointed him to be one of their ambassadors to the United Nations, so the court dismissed this suit based on diplomatic immunity. However, these initiatives are an important way to keep pressure and attention on Sri Lanka's injustices. This is an area in which Canadian Tamils can be extremely helpful. There are a countless number of survivors of Sri Lanka's genocide who are now residing in Canada, including in this very room. If these survivors are willing to file a lawsuit against Sri Lankan officials in a legal case for genocide, that would strengthen our work for justice. We are actively looking for survivors who feel safe coming forward in this way. Top Sri Lankan officials, starting with President Mahinda Rajapaksa and Defense Secretary Gotabaya Rajapaksa, must be brought to justice. As evidence of the ongoing atrocities, add to evidence of the 2009 massacres, such as the mass grave found in Mullaitivu this week. International pressure for justice for Tamils is growing. This Monday, the UN Human Rights Council starts what will be a crucial session for our community. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, released a powerful report last week on Sri Lanka's deteriorating human rights situation and urgently called for an independent international investigation into violations of international law in Sri Lanka. The United States has pledged to support a strong resolution on Sri Lanka, and we are hopeful that this resolution will establish a commission of inquiry that unequivocally condemns Sri Lanka's genocide. We still have a long way to go to see Tamils living freely and in peace in our traditional homeland of Tamilulam, but we shouldn't lose sight of how far we have come since the horrific bloodbath of 2009. The world now recognizes Sri Lanka as an authoritarian dictatorship that cannot be trusted with the fate of thousands of Tamils who were killed in 2009. From this realization, we must show the world that Sri Lanka cannot be trusted with the political future of Tamils either. Now I will turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Nimmi Gaurinathan, who will continue the discussion on the situation facing Tamil women.